How can a CEO avoid making big, expensive mistakes? We take a deep dive into project risks and show you how they can turn into expensive issues, and importantly, how to avoid them. Let's get into it. Are you seeking to be a high-performance CEO or develop personal leadership and be a CEO in your own life? Then you've come to the right place, because we share real experiences from CEOs for you to learn from. And so you don't miss out, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. Let's get into it. As a CEO of your own business, you'll be taking on risk all the time. Risk isn't something like calling it risky. It doesn't mean the same thing. What it means is that there's a potential for unknown factors or threats to your project, your program, or your initiative. Now, luckily, there are great tools to help us manage risk, reduce risk, transfer risk, or in other words, try to alleviate that threat that is looming there in the future. Many business managers I know don't take much notice of risk. They go into it eyes wide shut, as we say. It's my job, I feel, to eliminate those risks and try to have the business manager understand the risks that they're taking on, knowing how to accept those risks and how to manage those risks. Now, in this particular example, we look at a company I've worked with for several years, and we'll take you through the risks and how they actually ignored those and how they become really big, expensive issues. Had they been managed earlier on, a lot of the expense could have been avoided. Several years ago, my team and I were invited to help a company develop and commercialize a product. Now, the good news was that we were given access to their customers, so we could work directly with their customer to define a specification, which we did. We were also given a reference design or previous work that had been done, and we were given instructions to not redesign, but to reuse that design. Now, that's a small concern to us, because when we do the design work from scratch, we make sure that all of that work will fold straight into the specification. But the situation became even more critical when we found out that that reference design was not ready for production. The company that made that reference design specifically said that. So that was a big red flag for us. It was a big risk. Now, as part of our project workup, we take on to look at the risks and issues, put together a specification, work out a timeline, cost estimations, and those sorts of things. Project management, it's called. Now, often project management is diminished in the business community. It's seen as a overhead, as a unnecessary and irrelevant task. Well, in this case, as I point out, this kind of work is highly valuable and can save a company thousands of dollars. Now, the key part of that, as I said, is the risk profile. So we develop a risk profile. There's a risk framework that comes first. This essentially puts on the axis of consequences from low to high and likelihood from low to high. So when we think about consequences, we're thinking about what happens if that risk becomes a reality. So just to use the analogy of crossing a road, if you get hit by a car, the consequences can be very serious. You might have a slight bruise, you might have a slight scare, or you might even be killed. So the consequences can be extremely high. Then there's the likelihood that it can occur. Now, the likelihood does depend on the circumstances, your situation, how you are approaching the traffic. Are you taking care crossing the road? Is the road busy? Is the traffic high? Is the speed of the traffic very high? So the likelihood can vary based on the situation. Now, it's important to understand that framework, because often we don't rank risks that way when we think about them in terms of projects. So in terms of projects, we generally rank the consequences as the cost to the project. And in this particular case, they ranked from under $100 to over $1,000, over $10,000, or over $100,000. And if the consequences were over $100,000, that was considered a very high consequence. Now, on the likelihood scale, low means below about 0.1% and high means pretty much almost certain, or higher than 90% likelihood of occurring. So if you've got something which is a high consequence, $100,000 or more, and a high likelihood, in other words, it's 90% likely to occur, then is put into a ranking known as extreme. And of course, that requires immediate attention. So having developed that risk framework for that company, we could move on to the risk profile for that project. Now, just to step back a little bit, a risk framework is something that's individual to each company. And it's that way because it depends on the company's size, their ability to deal with the high consequences. I used to work for a company, Qantas, where their catastrophic was over 500 million. Now this small company, its catastrophic would be over 500,000. So it varies from company to company, and it can also change over time if the company grows, for example. But certainly that framework can be put aside and used for other projects. Now notice I'm using the term projects. Many business people like to use other words like venture or initiative, but putting it into a project means we can start to use all the language of projects and we can start managing things like risk. So I like to put things into terms like project. So back to the risk profile. In this particular project, we identified 25 project risks. Now again, back to the Qantas case, I was working on a project which had over 125 risks. So again, the profile depends on the project, and the size of the profile depends on how complex it is. This wasn't as complex as the Qantas project, so we identified 25 risks. So how do you identify those risks? Well, we identify the project that we're trying to achieve, and we look at whether certain things can occur in order to make us successful. It's really a great point of discussion between the company, the engineers, the marketing, and salespeople about identifying the risks. It's very valuable work which is often skipped over. But it can be something simple like input signal conditioning. Now that's a highly technical term, but we didn't understand the signal very well in this particular project. We didn't understand the characteristics of the input signal. Now, we thought that the company would know more and that would come out over time, but we certainly identified it as a risk and we ranked that risk. We ranked it that it was high in terms of if we didn't get that input signal conditioning right, costs could be greater than $100,000. And what was the likelihood? Well, because we as the vendor didn't understand the input signal, we ranked it as fairly high. So greater than 50-60% chance of occurring. Having developed that whole risk profile, and in particular all the rankings, we were able to present that to our client. So we did that fairly early on, as early as we could after working through, and we actually put together a simple metric which basically rolled up all of those risks into a number, and that number said, well, we believe this project has substantial risks. The next part of that is to work on mitigating those risks. Now it's important to understand that risks can be mitigated, they can be transferred, they can be ignored, and they can be accepted. I'm going to focus mostly on the mitigation of risks because that's where I believe we had the problems in this particular project. Many of those risks became managed and mitigated, as we say. So for example, we looked at the parts that were needed, and there was some parts that we felt had long lead times or weren't accessible. We did some work, we spent some engineering time and money and effort to find parts that we could replace and design them in. We were able to take that risk, which was on the high side, and make it a low risk. So at each one of those 25 risks, in turn, they were worked on. We spent time, money, and effort to reduce those risks. And over a period of time, we were able to reduce many of those risks down to quite low values. However, and this is where it gets a little tricky, as a client and as a vendor, it's often not easy for us to manage that relationship to the point to force them to do things. And some of the things were just clearly outside of our realm of expertise. And despite our many requests and many times we pushed up those risks were not being managed or mitigated. So fast forward to about 18 months later, and the risk profile of the overall project actually had reduced significantly because of all of the mitigation actions that we'd taken as a vendor. Now, these cost time, money, they're also valuable. And often business people don't understand the value of putting time and money into reducing risk. However, we're going to see how a risk becomes an issue in this particular case. So back to our input signal conditioning risk that we highlighted back at the start. Now, 18 months later, that risk was still there and it still had that high ranking. No work had been done. We were working on the project and we started to have a few bugs. We couldn't get the kind of performance we were expecting out of the product. We had our engineers working on it and we were getting all sorts of issues. One of them was called the lost data issue. Data was going missing. Then it became the compression issue. We couldn't figure out how to get the data through. After about 2 months of engineering effort where we had multiple people involved, and it cost tens of thousands of dollars, we realized that the problem was caused by that risk that had been sitting in the project all this time. Effectively, the lack of understanding about the input signal was causing this issue. Effectively, we were trying to get too much out of the system instead of being able to push the 8 kilohertz that we needed to get through the system. We could only get 4 kilohertz through the system. When we went back and investigated further, we found that this was an inherited problem from the previous design, from the previous lack of understanding about the input signal that had been there for nearly 2 years. Now, luckily for us and the client, we found a solution to that problem. However, it was a compromise on the ideal product performance. It was satisfactory and it met the particular product that we were targeting, but it did limit the system from being used in other ways that would have really optimized its capabilities into other projects and other products. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that had we fixed this issue 2 years ago, we would have spent a few $1,000s and we would have fixed it, and all the way through the system we would have had that in check. Now at the end of the project, that risk has become an issue. That issue has cost us many tens of thousands of dollars, or at least our clients many tens of thousands of dollars, many months of delay, and a compromise to the overall project's performance. This is how a risk can manifest itself into an issue. It's something that I think is very hard to explain to some managers and leaders, that risk is a threat to the success of the project. And by not managing it and not taking care of it, you can effectively really cost your company time, money, effort, and ultimately specification of your product. When I step back and I look at the decisions that were made early on in the project, I think of it as somebody going on a journey. They want to get from A to B, and there's a path that leads from A to B, but it's a long path, and they don't have the energy to get from A to B, so they decide to take a shortcut. Now the shortcut goes through a swamp. Now the swamp is quicker, it looks like it's quicker, but there's risks. There may be something dangerous in the swamp there that causes you some significant delays and significant problems. And that may or may not occur. You may get through the swamp without any problem, but there's a risk. And in this case, the risk became an issue. You got stuck in that swamp. That swamp bogged you down and actually cost you more than if you'd just gone from A to B. So why do business people sort of jump into those types of situations? Well, in this case, I believe it's fundamentally the limitations in cash. They looked at the amount of work that they wanted to achieve and how quickly they wanted it done, and they had a limited amount of cash that needed to be done. They felt the only alternative was to take the shortcut and, I guess, head in the sand, ignore those risks, treat them as if they don't exist, or just not worry about them today and kick the can down the road, as they say. So I really do believe we can make better decisions as managers than just to put our head in the sand and ignore them. So what are the top tips that we can offer you as a CEO to help you avoid turning those risky ventures into issues? Well, step one, treat all of your ventures, your initiatives, your ideas, the things that you're going to spend money on as a project. Now, use the project language and the project management framework to think about how you're going to do something. That naturally invokes number two, which is risks. Take time to identify risks and figure out where the risks are in the profile. This is something that you can't do on your own. You need to involve the members of your team. If you have a vendor, you can even involve to some extent your customers to figure out what the risk profile is of that venture. And thirdly is to act on those risks, to reduce those risks. There's many ways to do it. We focused on mitigating that risk in this example, and I encourage everybody to focus on that. But you can also transfer risks, you can accept risks. Those risks that are ranked high need to be acted on. Putting the head in the sand, as we say, is no way to manage a project. It's management by hope. We need to manage by making decisions and acting. And it's this framework which is so helpful to help us be better leaders and to be more successful with our ventures. So I hope that helps, and thanks for watching.